talked about it last night. I don't think she submitted it yet.
Who's in your group? Oh, Bree. I heard Maria. I was thinking, Maria? I don't think I have a Maria. Okay, so let's talk about in your bell ringer. There were two characters that we've met. I asked you to name and describe one of them. You said Piggy. Okay, tell us about Piggy.
He's the smart one.
Okay.
He's kind of
Yeah, he's chubby. And his glasses are really thick. Anybody else pick Piggy? You did? Okay.
Yeah.
Did you say anything else besides what we've just said?
Who?
Okay. So he is smart. He's chubby. He's got thick glasses, but he's the one that's thinking right now. He's also the one that tells us that the fighter pilot, his plane was on fire. He said, yeah, no, he's not coming back to rescue us. His plane was on fire. Okay. And he said that the cabin of the plane had been pulled back out to water, out to sea after it had left the scar in the jungle. And he said there were probably kids on there. So we know they're drowned. He's also like, hey, we need to gather the rest of them. He's the one thinking of all the things that they need to do. However, Ralph is the one that we're going to find is appealing to the other kids. Because did anybody describe Ralph? You described Ralph? Okay. How did you describe Ralph?
He's very free. He just kind of does his own thing because he doesn't think that he has any responsibility, and he just kind of thinks that he's not really thinking about anything that's going on around him. He's kind of blind to his surroundings right now.
Yeah, because he's just thinking, hey, we're on a tropical island. We don't have adults around. Yeah, that's his feeling. That's how Ralph is thinking. Now, they describe Ralph as fair-haired. He's a nice-looking boy. Okay. And we're going to find, as we read the story, that Ralph is one of those kids that's appealing to other kids. He doesn't think about things the way Piggy does. This is what we need to do. But he has the charisma. Okay.
In the story, Ralph's kind of more of the one that everybody wants to lead, but then he turns out to not be a good leader because he only wants the fun stuff and he doesn't care about the hard stuff.
At least at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. At this point in the story, that's what it sounds like. Yeah. Okay. So let's continue reading. So we were in the first chapter, the sound of the shell, and did we get to the part where they picked up the conch shell? No, we did not, did we? That was because I have a sophomore class 5th period too. I think we got to the conch shell in that class. What did we get to?
I don't remember.
Okay. Let's see, they used to call me Piggy. We got to that.
What day is it?
It's Tuesday, the 13th. Okay. Behind the platform, there was more enchantment. Bankside. Oh, they were swimming. We got to that part.
Yeah, I was about to say the last part I remember is after they started getting out of the water. And
Okay.
They were talking, and he was screw your eyes.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, so here we are. So they're getting out, and Ralph says, get my clothes, muttered Ralph along there. He trotted through the sand, enduring the sun's enmity, crossed the platform, and found his scattered clothes. To put on a gray shirt once more was strangely pleasing. Then he climbed the edge of the platform and sat in the green shade on a convenient trunk. Piggy hauled himself up, carrying most of his clothes under his arms. Then he sat carefully on a fallen trunk near the little cliff that fronted the lagoon, and the tangled reflections quivered over him. Presently he spoke. We got to find the others. We got to do something. Ralph said nothing. Here was a coral island, protected from the sun. Ignoring Piggy's ill-omened talk, he dreamed pleasantly. Piggy insisted. How many of us are there? Ralph came forward and stood by Piggy. I don't know. Here and there, little breezes crept over the polished waters beneath the haze of heat. When the breezes reached the platform, the palm fronds would whisper so that spots of blurred sunlight slid over their bodies or moved like bright winged things in the shade. Piggy looked up at Ralph. All the shadows on Ralph's face were reversed, green above, bright below from the lagoon. A blur of sunlight was crawling across his hair. We got to do something. Ralph looked through him. Here at last was the imagined but never fully realized place leaping into real life. Ralph's lips parted in a delighted smile, and Piggy, taking the smile to himself as a mark of recognition, laughed with pleasure. If it really is an island, what's that? Ralph had stopped smiling and was pointing into the lagoon. Something creamy lay among the ferny weeds. A stone? No, a shell. Suddenly, Piggy was a bubble with decorous excitement. That's right. It's a shell. I've seen one like that before on someone's back wall. A conch, he called it. He used to blow it, and then his mom would come. It's ever so valuable. Near to Ralph's elbow, a palm sapling leaned out over the lagoon. Indeed, the weight was already pulling a lump from the poor soil, and soon it would fall. He tore out the stem and began to poke about in the water while the brilliant fish flicked away on this side and that. Piggy leaned dangerously. Careful, you'll break it. Shut up. Ralph spoke absently. The shell was interesting and pretty and a worthy plaything, but the vivid phantoms of his daydream still interposed between him and Piggy, who in this context was an irrelevance. The palm sapling, bending, pushed the shell across the weeds. Ralph used one hand as a fulcrum and pressed down with the other till the shell rose, dripping, and Piggy could make a grab. Now the shell was no longer a thing seen, but not to be touched. Ralph, too, became excited. Piggy babbled. A conch, ever so expensive. I bet if you wanted to buy one, you'd have to pay pounds and pounds and pounds. Pounds is their division of money, not their denomination of money. It's like $1. A pound is about the same as $1. He had it on his garden wall, and my auntie, Ralph took the shell from Piggy, and a little water ran down his arm. In color, the shell was deep cream, touched here and there with fading pink. Between the point, worn away into a little hole, and the pink lips of the mouth lay 18 inches of shell with a slight spiral twist, and covered with a delicate embossed pattern. Ralph shook sand out of the deep tube. Mooed like a cow, he said. He had some white stones, too, and a bird cage with a green parrot. He didn't know the white stones, of course, and he said, Piggy paused for breath and stroked the glistening thing that lay in Ralph's hands. Ralph! Ralph looked up. We can use this to call the others. Have a meeting. They'll come when they hear us. He beamed at Ralph. That was what you meant, didn't you? That's why you got the conch out of the water? Ralph pushed back his fair hair. How did your friend blow the conch? Was that really why Ralph got it out of the water? To blow it and call the others to a meeting? No, Ralph is still like, oh, hey, this is cool. So Ralph is still thinking in terms of, guys, I would call it innocence in a way. Ralph is denying what their situation might be right now. Okay? Ralph is sort of an innocent character. Doesn't like to look too deeply into what's really happening. He'll have to, but right now he's not. He kind of spat, said Piggy. My auntie wouldn't let me blow on account of my asthma. He said you blew from down here. Piggy laid a hand on his jutting abdomen. You try, Ralph. You'll call the others. Doubtfully, Ralph laid the small end of the shell against his mouth and blew. There came a rushing sound from its mouth, but nothing more. Ralph wiped the salt water off his lips and tried again, but the shell remained silent. He kind of spat. Guys, anybody play the trumpet or a trombone or any kind of instrument like that? You did? Yeah. Do you remember how you would have to make this? You'd have to kind of into your mouthpiece. Yeah. I used to play the trumpet. So, French horn. Ooh, even tinier little mouthpiece. Yeah. I had a trumpet teacher who told me I had tuba lips. Thanks. Okay. Ralph pursed his lips and squirted air into the shell, which emitted a low farting noise. This amused both boys so much that Ralph went on squirting for some minutes between bouts of laughter. He blew from down here. Ralph grasped the idea and hit the shell with air from his diaphragm. Immediately, the thing sounded. A deep, harsh note boomed under the palms, spread through the intricacies of the forest, and echoed back from the pink granite of the mountain. Clouds of birds rose from the treetops, and something squealed and ran in the undergrowth. Ralph took the shell away from his lips. Gosh. His ordinary voice sounded like a whisper after the harsh note of the conch. He laid the conch against his lips, took a deep breath, and blew once more. The note boomed again, and then at his firmer pressure, the note, fluking up an octave, became a strident blare, more penetrating than before. Piggy was shouting something, his face pleased, his glasses flashing. The birds cried, small animals scuttered. Ralph's breath failed. The note dropped the octave, became a low whubber. It was a rush of air. The conch was silent, a gleaming tusk. Ralph's face was dark with breathlessness, and the air over the island was full of bird clamor and echoes ringing. I bet you can hear that for miles. Ralph found his breath and blew a series of short blasts. Piggy exclaimed, "There's one!" A child had appeared among the palms about 100 yards along the beach. He was a boy of perhaps 6 years, sturdy and fair, his clothes torn, his face covered with a sticky mess of fruit. His trousers had been lowered for an obvious purpose and had only been pulled back halfway. Why had his trousers been lowered? Yeah. And he's got a sticky face because he's been eating some of the fruit. He jumped off the palm terrace into the sand, and his trousers fell about his ankles. He stepped out of them and trotted to the platform. So he just walks out of them. You know what? When my brother was little, and he'd go to when he was like 3 or 4 years old, he'd go to the bathroom. He'd leave his shorts off first or his jeans. And then sometimes, if the next time he went, so he was just running around in his underwear. And the next time he might leave those off too. But yeah.
My dad, when he was really little, he used to sleepwalk and he would pee in corners of the house.
Yeah.
Me and my aunt, you know how like the little kids they have like the kitchen sets and stuff?
Yeah.
My aunt had one of those and he was sleepwalking one night and he peed in the sink of the house.
Yeah. Yep. Let's see. Piggy helped him up. Meanwhile, Ralph continued to blow till voices shouted in the forest. The small boy squatted in front of Ralph, looking up brightly and vertically. As he received the reassurance of something purposeful being done, he began to look satisfied, and his only clean digit, a pink thumb, slid into his mouth. So you've got this can you imagine being 6 years old and, here you are stranded on this island, nobody around. And finally, somebody, oh, here's a bigger boy. Okay. Yeah. Somebody's going to tell me what to do. So imagine being 5 or 6 and in this situation. Piggy leaned down to him. "What's your name, Johnny?" Piggy muttered the name to himself and then shouted it to Ralph, who was not interested because he was still blowing. So Piggy's like, we need to know who everybody is. And so he's like, "What's your name? Johnny?" "Okay, Johnny." He's thinking to himself, okay, we got Johnny. And Piggy is the one. Piggy might grow up to be an accountant or something, That's the kind of way he thinks. So Ralph, who was not interested because he was still blowing on the conch, his face was dark with the violent pleasure of making this stupendous noise, and his heart was making the stretched shirt shake. The shouting in the forest was nearer. Signs of life were visible now on the beach. The sand, trembling beneath the heat haze, concealed many figures in its miles of length. Boys were making their way toward the platform through the hot, dumb sand. 3 small children, no older than Johnny, appeared from startlingly close at hand, where they had been gorging fruit in the forest. A dark little boy, not much younger than Piggy, parted a tangle of undergrowth, walked onto the platform, and smiled cheerfully at everybody. More and more of them came. Taking their cue from the innocent Johnny, they sat down on the fallen palm trunks and waited. Ralph continued to blow short, penetrating blasts. Piggy moved among the crowd, asking names and frowning to remember them. The children gave him the same simple obedience that they had given to the men with megaphones. Some were naked and carrying their clothes, others half naked, or more or less dressed in school uniforms, gray, blue, fawn, jacketed, or jerseyed. So there's a mix of kids. They're not all from the same school. Okay, that's why their uniforms are different colors. There were badges, mottos even, stripes of color in stockings and pullovers. A pullover is a sweater. Their heads clustered above the trunks in the green shade, heads brown, fair, black, chestnut, sandy, mouse-colored. Heads muttering, whispering, heads full of eyes that watched Ralph and speculated. Something was being done. So they're all looking to Ralph. Ralph blew the conch. And he's the bigger boy. The children who came along the beach, singly or in twos, leaped into visibility when they crossed the line from heat haze to nearer sand. Here, the eye was first attracted to a black, bat-like creature that danced on the sand, and only later perceived the body above it. The bat was the child's shadow, shrunk by the vertical sun to a patch between the hurrying feet. Even while he blew, Ralph noticed the last pair of bodies that reached the platform above, a fluttering patch of black. The 2 boys, bullet-headed and with hair like tow, flung themselves down and lay grinning and panting at Ralph like dogs. They were twins, and the eye was shocked and incredulous at such cheery duplication. They breathed together. They grinned together. They were chunky and vital. They raised their wet lips at Ralph, for they seemed I lost my place. For they seemed provided with not quite enough skin, so that their profiles were blurred and their mouths pulled open. Piggy sent his flashing glasses to them and could be heard between the blasts, repeating their names. Sam, Eric, Sam, Eric. Then he got muddled. The twins shook their heads and pointed at each other, and the crowd laughed. At last, Ralph ceased to blow and sat there, the conch trailing from one hand, his head bowed on his knees. As the echoes died away, so did the laughter, and there was silence. Within the diamond haze of the beach, something dark was fumbling along. Ralph saw it first and watched till the intentness of his gaze drew all eyes that way. Then the creature stepped from the mirage onto clear sand, and they saw that the darkness was not all shadow, but mostly clothing. The creature was a party of boys, marching approximately in step in 2 parallel lines and dressed in strangely eccentric clothing, shorts, shirts, and different garments they carried in their hands, but each boy wore a square black cap with a silver badge on it. Their bodies from throat to ankle were hidden by black cloaks which bore a long silver cross on the left breast, and each neck was finished off with a ham bone frill. A little bit they're wearing, but yeah, it wasn't uncommon for schoolboys, private schoolboys in England at the time, to have a cloak of some type, and they're talking about like a frill around, like a white frill around the top of their cloaks. Okay, but they're marching together in line, almost in lockstep here. The heat of the tropics, the descent, the search for food, and now the sweaty march along the blazing beach had given them the complexions of newly washed plums. So they're overheated. They're keeping all these things on, and they're completely overheated, so their faces are flushed dark purple colors because of the heat. The boy who controlled them was dressed in the same way, though his cap badge was golden. When his party was about 10 yards from the platform, he shouted an order, and they halted, gasping, sweating, swaying in the fierce light. The boy himself came forward, vaulted onto the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. "Where's the man with the trumpet?" Ralph, sensing his sun blindness, answered him. "There's no man with a trumpet, only me." The boy came close and peered down at Ralph, screwing up his face as he did so. What he saw of the fair-haired boy with the creamy shell on his knees did not seem to satisfy him. He turned quickly, his black cloak circling. "Isn't there a ship then?" Inside the floating cloak, he was tall, thin, and bony, and his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without stillness. Out of this face stared two light blue eyes, frustrated now and turning, or ready to turn, to anger. "Isn't there a man here?" Ralph spoke to his back. "No, we're having a meeting. Come and join in." The group of cloaked boys began to scatter from close line. The tall boy shouted at them, "Choir, stand still." Wearily obedient, the choir huddled into line and stood there swaying in the sun. Nonetheless, some began to protest faintly. "But Meridew, please, Meridew, can't we?" Then one of the boys flopped on his face in the sand and the line broke up. They heaved the fallen boy to the platform and let him lie. Meridew, his eyes staring, made the best of a bad job. "All right then, sit down, let him alone." "But Meridew, he's always throwing a feint," said Meridew. "He did in Gib and Addis and at Matins over the precentor." Whatever all that means. The last piece of shot brought sniggers from the choir, who perched like black birds on the crisscross trunks and examined Ralph with interest. Piggy asked no names. He was intimidated by this uniformed superiority and the offhand authority in Meridew's voice. He shrank to the other side of Ralph and busied himself with his glasses. Meridew turned to Ralph. "Aren't there any grown-ups?" "No." Meridew sat down on a trunk and looked around the circle. "Then we'll have to look after ourselves." Secure on the other side of Ralph, Piggy spoke timidly. "That's why Ralph made a meeting, so we can decide what to do. We've heard names. That's Johnny. Those two, they're twins, Sam and Eric." "Which is Eric? You?" "No, you're Sam. I'm Sam. And I'm Eric." "We'd better all have names," said Ralph. "So I'm Ralph." "We got most names," said Piggy. "Got 'em just now." "Kids' names," said Meridew. "Why should I be Jack? I'm Meridew." Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. "Then," went on Piggy, "the boy, I forget." "You're talking too much," said Jack Meridew. "Shut up, fatty." Laughter arose. "He's not fatty," cried Ralph. "His real name's Piggy." "Piggy, Piggy, oh, Piggy." This is not what Piggy wanted to happen. A storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. For the moment, the boys were a closed circuit of sympathy with Piggy outside. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally, the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight, furtive boy whom no one knew, who kept to himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry. The choir boy who had fainted sat up against a palm trunk, smiled pallidly at Ralph, and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. "We've got to decide about being rescued." There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. "Shut up," said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. "Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things." "A chief! A chief!" "I ought to be chief," said Jack with simple arrogance, "because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp." Another buzz. Well then, said Jack, he hesitated. The dark boy, Roger, stirred at last and spoke up. Let's have a vote. Yes. Vote for chief. Let's vote. This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by a claim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size, an attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch. That the being that had blown that had sat waiting for them on the platform with the delicate thing balanced on his knees was set apart. Okay, so remember what I told you about Ralph. He was attractive. He was appealing. He's not the one with intelligence like Piggy. He's not an obvious leader like Jack. But he's an attractive boy. And even though, we're not talking about anything, I mean, they don't think of him that way, but he's appealing. And he had the conch. He called them together. Even if it was at Piggy's urging, he's the one with the conch. So they're all looking to him. Okay? So, him with the shell. Ralph, let him be chief with the trumpet thing. Ralph raised a hand for silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? With dreary obedience, look at that, dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. Who wants me? Every hand outside the choir except Piggy's was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Ralph counted. I'm chief then. The circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army or hunters. They could be. The suffusion drained away from Jack's face. Ralph waved again for silence. Jack's in charge of the choir. They could be, what do you want them to be? Hunters. Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. All right, choir, take off your togs. Togs is another name for clothes. As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, chattered, piled their black cloaks on the grass. Jack laid his hand on the trunk by Ralph. His gray shorts were sticking to him with sweat. Ralph glanced at them admiringly, and when Jack saw his glance, he explained, I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all around, but your shell called us. Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. Listen, everybody, I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more, we'd all get mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack and... He looked around the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys round Simon giggled, and he stood up, laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. I'll come. And I? Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. I'll come. Ralph turned to him. You're no good on a job like this. All the same, we don't want you, said Jack flatly. 3's enough. Piggy's glasses flashed. I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was. Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. If Simon walks in the middle of us, said Ralph, then we could talk over his head. The 3 of them fell into step. This meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. Presently Ralph stopped and turned back to Piggy. Look, Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. You can't come. Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. You told him, after what I said. His face flushed, his mouth trembled. After I said I didn't want, what on earth are you talking about? About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy. And I said not to tell, and then you went and said straight out. Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the two courses of apology or further insult. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. He turned and raced after the other two. Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The three boys walked briskly on the sand. The tide was low, and there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. A kind of glamour was spread over them in the scene, and they were conscious of the glamour and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing excitedly, talking, not listening. The air was bright. Ralph, faced by the task of translating all this into an explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arm shyly, and they had to laugh again. Come on, said Jack presently. We're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island and look around the corner, if it is an island. Now, toward the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island quite distinct and not magicked out of shape or sense. There was a jumble of the usual squareness with one great block sitting out in the lagoon. Seabirds were nesting there. Like icing, said Ralph, on a pink cake. We shan't see around this corner, said Jack, because there isn't one, only a slow curve, and you can see the rocks get worse. Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other that they had seen. We'll try climbing the mountain from here, he said. I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on. Three boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals. Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees. The forest minutely vibrated. Come on. The difficulty was not the steep ascent around the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here the roots and stems of creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to thread through them like pliant needles. Their only guide, apart from the brown ground and occasional flashes of light through the foliage, was the tendency of slope, whether this hole, laced as it was with the cables of creeper, stood higher than that. Somehow, they moved up. Inured to these tangles, at perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. Wacko, wizard, smashing! The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All three were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as their thighs and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph shouted experimentally, and they listened to the muted echoes. This is real exploring, said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before. We ought to draw a map, said Ralph, only we haven't any paper. We can make scratches on bark, said Simon, and rub black stuff in. Again came the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. Wacko, wizard! There was no place for standing on one's head. This time, Ralph expressed the intensity of his emotion by pretending to knock Simon down, and soon they were a happy heaving pile in the underdusk. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. Got to get on. The peaked granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. With openness came the sun, dried the sweat that had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. At last, the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock, with no more plunging through darkness. The boys chose their way through defiles and over heaps of sharp stone. Look, look! High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. Come on! But not come on to the top. The assault on the summit must wait while the three boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave! Sway back and forth, catch the rhythm. Heave! Increase the swing of the pendulum. Increase, come up and bear against that point of furthest balance. Increase, heave! The great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leaped droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew, white and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster. And then the island was still. Wacko! Like a bomb! Wee-ah-ho! Not for 5 minutes could they drag themselves away from this triumph, but they left at last. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. Golly! They were on the lip of a circular hollow in the side of the mountain. This was filled with a blue flower, a rock plant of some sort. And the overflow hung down the vent and spilled lavishly among the canopy of the forest. The air was thick with butterflies lifting, fluttering, settling. Beyond the hollow was the square top of the mountain, and soon they were standing on it. They had guessed before that this was an island, clambering among the pink rocks with the sea on either side and the crystal heights of air. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. It was roughly boat-shaped, humped near this end, with behind them the jumbled descent to the shore. On either side, rocks, cliffs, treetops, and a steep slope. Forward there, the length of the boat, a tamer descent, tree-clad with hints of pink, and then the jungly flat of the island, dense green, but drawn at the end to a pink tail. There, where the island petered out in water, was another island, a rock almost detached, standing like a fort, facing them across the green with one bold pink bastion. The boys surveyed all this, then looked out to sea. They were high up, and the afternoon had advanced. The view was not robbed of sharpness by mirage. That's a reef, a coral reef. I've seen pictures like that. The reef enclosed more than one side of the island, lying perhaps a mile out and parallel to what they now thought of as their beach. The coral was scribbled in the sea as though a giant hand bent down to reproduce the shape of the island in a flowing chalk line, but tired before he had finished. Inside was peacock water, rocks and weeds showing as in an aquarium. Outside was the dark blue of the sea. The tide was running so that long streaks of foam tailed away from the reef, and for a moment they felt that the boat was moving steadily astern. Jack pointed down. That's where we landed. Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were the splintered trunks and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There, too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform, with insect-like figures moving near it. Ralph sketched a twining line from the bald spot on which they stood down a slope, a gully, through flowers, round and round to the rock where the scar started. That's the quickest way back. Eyes shining, mouths open, triumphant, they savored the right of domination. They were lifted up, were friends. There's no village, Smoke, and no boat, said Ralph wisely. We'll make sure later, but I think it's uninhabited. We'll get food, cried Jack. Hunt, catch things until they fetch us. Simon looked at them both, saying nothing, but nodding till his black hair flapped backwards and forwards. His face was glowing. Ralph looked down the other way, where there was no reef. Steeper, said Jack. Ralph made a cupping gesture. That bit of forest down there, the mountain holds it up. Every point of the mountain held up trees, flowers and trees. Not the forest stirred, roared, flailed. Now the forest stirred, roared, flailed. The nearer acres of rock flowers fluttered, and for half a minute the breeze blew cool on their faces. Ralph spread his arms. All ours! They laughed and tumbled and shouted on the mountain. I'm hungry. When Simon mentioned his hunger, the others became aware of theirs. Come on, said Ralph. We found out what we wanted to know. They scrambled down a rock slope, dropped among flowers, and made their way under the trees. Here they paused and examined the bushes round them curiously. Simon spoke first. Like candles, candle bushes, candle buds. The bushes were dark evergreen and aromatic, and the many buds were waxen green and folded up against the light. Jack slashed at one with his knife, and the scent spilled over them. Candle buds. You couldn't light them, said Ralph. They just look like candles. Green candles, said Jack contemptuously. We can't eat them. Come on. They were in the beginnings of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hoofs on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. Oops, okay. Guys, I'll have to finish chapter 1 tomorrow. I was worried we wouldn't get done. Oh, we were almost done. We were very, very close. We just had a few paragraphs left. Okay. Have a good lunch. I'll see you tomorrow. What?
My speech.
Oh, we can't in SRT tomorrow. You're going to be taking the PSAT.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We can do it tomorrow in here. All right.